Good evening and welcome to the New School. My name is Nevin Cohen. I'm Chair of Environmental Studies, and with Radhika Subramanian, who's in the back of the room, in yellow, have organized and co-curated an exhibition called Living Concrete, Carrot City, which if you haven't seen yet, I encourage you to go over and see. It's at the Sheila Johnson Design Center galleries on 13th Street and 5th Avenue. And that exhibition focuses on civic urban agriculture and the way in which communities can actually grow their own food and empower themselves and support their community through food production. Tonight, our focus is on food justice, and we're delighted to have Bob Gottlieb here to speak, but I'm not going to introduce Bob. I'm going to introduce our new Executive Dean of the New School for General Studies, David Scobie, who will do the introductions. And it's my real pleasure to introduce David. He comes to us from Bates and College in Maine, and is one of the leading thinkers on civic engagement in universities, and we're really happy that he's the new Dean of the New School for General Studies. So with that, welcome, David.
Thanks to Nevin, and thanks to all of you for coming. This is a wonderful event. Part of my excitement in coming to the New School and getting a chance to help lead the New School for General Studies, which is now merged with the Milano School of Management and Urban Policy, is that our division is really a kind of educational experiment committed to interdisciplinary engagement with the most important issues and problems in the world, to seeing and confronting those issues whole, three-dimensionally, not parsing them and parceling them out into different divisions, to do so in the name of the democratic purposes of higher education, of teaching, learning, and scholarship, and to do so in ways that generate innovative new ways of teaching, learning, public action. And I give you that little sketch of the values of our division for two reasons. One is that the environmental studies program, and in particular Living Concrete Carrot City, and Nevin's and Radhika's and others' work wonderfully exemplifies all of those values of interdisciplinary engagement and public work. And this whole semester's programs, the exhibition they've co-curated, and the larger project of confronting urban agriculture and all of its issues is a wonderful exemplar of what we're trying to do educationally. The second reason I mention them, and more important for tonight, is that our guest, Robert Gottlieb, also exemplifies those values in his work. He's the Henry Luce Professor of Urban Environmental Studies and the founding director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at Occidental College. He's the author and editor of many books on environmentalism, on urban issues, and on issues of the food system and food justice. And he himself exemplifies the very best of what a democratically engaged creative scholar and teacher can be. He's going to talk to us tonight about his work around issues of food justice and the way that food studies engages some of the most important issues of social justice and inequality in the society. So join me in welcoming Bob Gottlieb.
First of all, I bring greetings from Los Angeles. Just last Sunday, can you hear me if I wander? Okay, I'm a wanderer when I talk. Last Sunday, I was able to take a bike ride from East Hollywood to Boyle Heights along with upwards of 100,000 people, emulating what's also been done here in New York, and it's all part of the changing landscape in Los Angeles, of which food is a significant part of that changing landscape. And it was close to cars, and went through neighborhoods and. Okay, I won't wander then. I'll even be a little more formal, and since there are too many of you to go around the room and introduce yourself, which would be, of course, helpful, I'm going to just ask briefly if, and you can raise your hand if you're involved in urban agriculture, just a handful, in food policy and food politics work, food and health, more. It's the obviously emerging area. Food and schools, farm to school, or other kinds of school food issues. Those of you who are not involved in any kind of food issue but interested in checking it out, a fair number. Let me tell you a little bit about our work just for a moment to kind of situate the things I want to bring up around the new book on food justice and some of the politics in the food movement. We are what I would call action researchers. We engage in trying to bring about change through the different programs and some organizing work, some of the research, of course, in a whole range of areas, not just around food, but around issues like transportation and immigration and economic development. And we see the link between those issues, even when we have very specific programs like Farm to School. And my co-author in the food justice book, Anupama Joshi, who is part of our institute, is really the guru of the National Farm to School Network, which started with just a couple of schools in the late 1990s, and now is in every state in the country and in thousands of school districts. And it's indicative of the changes that you see developing around the interest in food and the changing landscape around food, but with some tensions around that. And I want to take you back to a period where I first got really engaged around food issues, and it was in the early 1990s. And I was writing a book, furiously trying to finish, called Forcing the Spring. And the book was a history of the environmental movement, a kind of a revisionist history of the environmental movement. The argument that I was making was that that environmental justice, which was emerging as a new type of environmental politics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, really could be traced back historically to a wide range of social movements around urban life, around the workplace, that would not have been identified as environmental. Since much of the way environmental movements and environmental politics were characterized as really addressing issues around connection to nature and not really embedded in daily life. And the genius of the environmental justice movement was both that it expanded the agenda. It said, look, environment is, to use the classic phrase, about where we live, work, and play. And it spoke a language that resonated for people in lots of different circumstances in the way that the mainstream environmental movement had not. It also had the language of justice. It said that environment, the way we experience it and where we live, work, and play, there are critical areas in which they are experienced differently in different communities, and that there are issues of environmental disparities, just as, and we'll talk in a second about food disparities. And what that did, what the environmental justice movement did, and what I was trying to capture in the book at that time, was to really shift the way the environmental movement as a whole considered those issues of daily life, and escape from the characterization of the environment was really it was kind of middle-class amenities. It was being able to go out and experience nature, and it didn't really connect with people, for example, who lived in low-income communities or communities of color, that somehow that was separate. And the environmental justice movement influenced the environmental movement as a whole, and it really changed the way it was perceived in the larger society, or began a process in which that change took place. And so I was very much into that at the time. I was also supervising a group of students. I was then at UCLA, and they wanted to do a kind of a major environmental justice research project. And they were exploring different connections with community groups, what would be the best way to approach it, when the riots took place. This is 1992. And they stepped back and they said, we can't proceed to do this type of project unless we really engage with the community to find out what they need most in terms of what are the issues that are so powerful for the community in the wake of the riots, and what the riots represented in terms of this kind of wake-up call to Los Angeles and to the country, for that matter. And so they stepped back and they decided they would look at, they'd do a needs assessment. They would work with different church groups and community groups to find out, as researchers, how could they connect, what would be the most compelling issues for them to delve into. And the answer they got was food. The food movement at that time was splintered between very different kinds of groups and approaches, but it was not perceived as something that would be so compelling. And to people in South LA, or to people in East LA. And what they were hearing is, yes, it is compelling, for some of the reasons that are now much more recognizable. No supermarkets had abandoned the community. There were a proliferation of fast food restaurants in South LA. There was the food that was available was expensive when they went to the stores. And the farmers' markets that had developed in LA, which initially in the late 1970s had really been a strategy for creating affordable, healthy, fresh food in low-income communities. That was really the rebirth of farmers' markets in the late 70s were focused along those lines. By the early 1990s, farmers' markets were not in low-income communities. They were considered part of a kind of a middle-class culture. And so they were getting feedback. We want a farmers' market in our community. We want to have community gardens in our community. So that launched the group to do a study, and got myself really engaged in thinking about food as an extension of the argument I was trying to make about environmental justice, that environment is where we live, where we work, where we play, and where we eat. And it's also obviously a lot of other ways to characterize where and how food is grown, how it's prepared, where it's sold, and how it's consumed, which are so compelling in terms of people connecting to it in terms of their daily life experiences. So it really fit. And the folks who did the study about how this food system was organized in a way that the people in the area that they focused on in South LA, what the problems were with the food system as a whole and what was happening in that community. And that was really the origins of thinking not just as food as a core issue that connected to the environment, but food as a compelling justice issue. I tell that story because I think we're at the same point in time that we were in the late 1980s and early 1990s around the environmental movement with today's food movement. The food movement today is expanding rapidly. It's changing institutions. It's certainly changing the discourse, the way people talk about food. There's also a lot of greenwashing going on around food because that discourse is changing. So Lay's potato chips say, you know, we are local. We use our local farmers and we create those potato chips. And Walmart says, well, we're going to go organic and we're going to go local. So there's what I would argue that's an indication of the reach of the food movement. But at the same time, as with the environmental movement back 20 years earlier, there is a sense that maybe the food movement is a niche movement. At least that's the criticism that you hear raised, that it's for people who can afford local and fresh food, that it's that farmers markets and community gardens are for people who have the time to participate or have the access to it in terms of their community. And it's not really representative of how and where people address and connect with food. And so we're at that point in time where the food movement faces that kind of challenge. We should probably turn this off, shouldn't we? It's distracting. I don't know if there's a way to do that. It was supposed to be when you came in, you could see the different images of the different people we profiled and encountered during the course of the book. So, so the idea of looking at food justice as an approach, identifying the ways in which food is so connected directly to the issue of disparities and injustices, is a critical way in which the food movement itself begins to be defined differently. And so we're seeing increasingly this challenge to the food movement as a whole to think about justice as part of the approach that is taken. So what do I mean by food justice? It's another question that when I mentioned to my 93-year-old mother-in-law that I was going to do a book on food justice. What's that? And it's easier to say, well, you're doing a book on food and looking at the problems that we encounter throughout food as a system. How it's grown, how it's processed and manufactured and packaged and distributed, how it's sold in retail and how it's consumed. That as a system, there are enormous problems that we've identified. We have an obesity epidemic. We have enormous environmental problems. It's a huge climate change issue. It's highly exploitive in terms of the people who work through the food supply chain. It's undermining at the global level the autonomy that rural communities had in terms of not only how and in what ways they grew food, but their own food security. Rural communities in this country but throughout the world. It's increasingly concentrated. In retail, there's a term that is used that we now have industrial food retail. We have mega corporations that operate globally that have created a way to structure how food is accessed and the nature of where and how you buy your food. We have a fast food industry that has penetrated throughout the world, as well as its ubiquitous presence in the United States. So when you think about food system issues, when you think about the supply chain, you think about the ways in which each step of the, or each component of that system generates the range of these problems, then that's part of the argument of food justice. It's a system problem. And food justice groups talk in system terms. That you can't isolate the idea that what happens to that farm worker is separate from the idea that that very same farm worker could be exposed to the inputs that one utilizes in growing food that create enormous environmental health problems, or that he or she and that the family that lives in the rural community where farm labor is employed doesn't have a supermarket, doesn't have good access to food. All the way through into the way the food system is organized, there's these powerful problems that exist at each stage that are connected to each other. So it's a system issue. But it's also one of that some of the problems that we see and we identify do have differential impacts. There is a huge obesity crisis in this country, but it's that much greater in low-income communities. We have a problem in terms of fast food. Fast food is ubiquitous. It can be found in every community, but it's more concentrated in low-income communities. We have issues around many people are employed in each of the different sectors of the food system. And the jobs that are increasingly relying on kind of a low-wage workforce have really transformed how that work is done. So in the food processing industry, say taking meat production or poultry, you not only have the problem of what's happened in terms of the nature of the product, chicken turned into chicken nuggets, or hormonal fed beef, but you have a workforce and an organization of those meat production plants and those poultry plants that are enormously exploitive of the labor that's used and the change that's taken place as that industry was restructured, shifted from a unionized, relatively well-paid workforce to a immigrant-based, non-union, incredibly exploited workforce. So you see the disparities issues as they relate also to work and labor in the food system. And so that's really the concept of food justice. To explain food justice is to look at it systemically, how these problems have been developed over time in terms of the organization of that food system. But it's also looking at the disparities that have been created at the same time that those problems emerged. So the purpose of writing the book on food justice was to both lay out the argument that there are system issues and their justice issues, and to take a walk through the food system and doing it. But also to spend time in the second half of our book, and what we're doing as this book is now launched, and we're going to be going around the country talking to different community groups and to campuses and to other places. The second half of the book tells the stories of resistance and change that we identify as seeking system change using the language of justice. So my next stop will be to New Orleans. We'll be working to get the word out in a number of different locations, but one of the groups that we profile in the book, who we will be having an event with them, is a group called the Rethinkers. And the Rethinkers are, amazingly, a group of middle school kids in New Orleans who, in the post-Katrina period, say beginning around 2006, the schools were a total mess, and they decided that they wanted to talk about and address and make demands about, we need to have a different kind of school. And they didn't start out thinking about school food, but they came to it relatively quickly. And it wasn't simply that the food tasted terrible, that they came to recognize that it wasn't being sourced in and connected to the very rich food culture of New Orleans. But they also had long lines in the lunchroom. They were, the whole environment of school food said that this is kind of hostile in terms of the food experience. So they started to mobilize, and they said, well, we want to source locally. How about dealing with our local shrimpers? You know, this is New Orleans. But instead, they're importing the shrimp from Costa Rica in a fish farm, a shrimp farm. And that's what's being sourced by the food district, the school district. And they said, we want a school garden. We want to be connected to food. And these are 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds. And they became one of the food justice champions around transforming school food. And they're really an inspiration. So we'll do an event with the Rethinkers to talk about what they've done and how they've influenced us, and putting it in the context of school food amongst many issues around food and food justice is so critical in terms of what needs to be changed and how it should be transformed. We will be working with a group of, from the cover of the book, Puerto Rican urban farmers, urban agriculture group up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, who started out again saying, we want a different source of food. We want to grow food that's appropriate to who we are and where we grew up. And they started growing some herbs that were connected to their recognizable cuisine. But in beginning to do that and creating some community gardens, they got increasingly into what some of the problems were that they were encountering in terms of food access, in terms of the desire to turn food into an opportunity. So they created a development project based on the herbs that they were growing and then expanding that in other ways. So it became a kind of symbol of how you begin to transform a community around food issues. And there are thousands of these stories. of people operating in their communities, thinking about ways that they can change how they can deal with every step of the way, whether it's how we're going to grow our food, how we're going to access our food, how we're going to prepare our food, and ultimately how food becomes part of daily life in ways that really challenge what that nature of that experience is today. So why don't I leave it at that so we can have a dialogue. I could tell more stories, but I'd rather hear either your stories or your thoughts or questions. Go ahead.
I came tonight because, as you described mother-in-law, I was curious about the juxtaposition of food and justice, because I think of food and culture. If I was going to lunch with a religious Buddhist Asian guy that I knew, we went to one of these Asian buffet places. Now you couldn't take in any quantity of food that you wanted, but when he went through the line, all the things, he took a very modest amount of things. We had a very small amount of stuff on his plate. And I was surprised because we both paid the same $8 to $10. But I think he was culturally incapable of eating more than he took on his plate. And I was curious about that because, Americans would have just glommed everything, once you pay your $8, you can consume everything, and Americans would have done that. But it never even occurred to him to do that. His whole cultural orientation to living was to do everything modestly. The same way, if you're raised in a cultural environment of McDonald's hamburgers and French fries and all that sort of thing, where hunger is discomfort that one has to eliminate, however one does that is acceptable, I don't see how one can make a cultural change, because it's not a rational question. It's an emotional question. And if you can't connect emotionally with the preferability or the desire or we have that same cultural disconnect politically. The political right, the difference between political right and political left in this country is more a cultural disconnect than a rational disconnect and a values disconnect. I just don't see how we can cross that cultural divide with respect to food unless you're somehow born to it or raised with it or have it in your environment in some way.
Okay, actually multiple questions in a way, or multiple comments. One is the issue of quantity, which is clearly a significant contribution to issues like obesity, where you've had really a transformation. It's not just the fast food industry, but it's significantly the impact that the fast food industry has had, and also the types of products where the quantity increases. From an 8-ounce cup of soda to a 42-ounce cup of soda is, as one of the public health folks who works in the food justice movement puts it, it's this sugar delivery system. One of the slides we had was the work that some of the students who got engaged in LA around food issues in schools, and particularly around vending machines. So they did their own research to quantify the amount of sugar that was the average consumption of a teenager during the week, and that was the jar of sugar that you saw in the slide. And that became a kind of very powerful message that they used when they went out and argued that we have to ban sodas from vending machines, which this was 2002. And it seemed inconceivable that that could happen. But in fact, the school board did ban sodas in LA school district, and and other school districts where that was occurring at the same time. So the issue of quantity is a significant one, and it's a cultural shift that took place most significantly in relation to the way the food industry operated in creating that as the cultural norm. And there are lots of other issues that went into that, and why they did it, and how they pulled it off. You know, the question of culture and cultural shift, and particularly the idea that somehow that American culture is such that it really goes against the possibility of appreciating or connecting to food in a way that it goes counter to the dominant culture, which is so embedded in our the way our tastes have developed. And maybe my perspective is influenced by coming from Los Angeles. And I would imagine that's true for people in New York. And I would argue it's increasingly becoming true around the country, where food culture is changing. There are shifts going on. I would argue that it's a kind of a hybrid culture of coming from many different sources. It's increasingly and profoundly an immigrant food culture in a place like Los Angeles. And that, in turn, you're starting to see a manifestation of that outside the most heavily immigrant metropolitan areas, urban areas. And it's a way in which people are beginning to experience food differently. It creates a sense of food in its diversity that is part of, I think, the food justice argument. And as with the other issues, it's the change is it's a protracted process. We do have a food industry that operates at multiple levels and is very powerful and is very concentrated, and will try and appropriate that language when the language begins to change and shift it towards the way it as an industry operates. So it's not a simple shift that's going to take place, but you can start to see it in a number of different ways, that whether it's in terms of schools, whether it's in terms of the role that gardens play, whether it's in terms of some of the programs we profiled in the book had to do with re-engaging with cooking. An enormous loss that developed over a period of time. We traced that in the book of why and how that happened in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and a kind of a re-engagement with cooking. And some of the food justice groups, a group in Vermont, a group down in Santa Fe, kind of the forerunners of thinking about cooking as a political act, as a way to sort of change the connection that one has to food. So I think the cultural issues are critical, but they're contested. They're not the dominant culture is not so dominant that we can't see where and how change can take place. Yeah. Why don't you identify yourselves and also say what you're doing and interested in, and then make your comment or question?
My name is Richard Carty. I'm a postdoc here in the Environmental Studies program, and I work on urban forest ecology. And my question has to do with the political and legal implications of the word justice, because to me, the word evokes the legal sphere. It doesn't have to, but it can. And I'm interested to know if, when you're talking about inequities in, let's say, quality of school food or access to healthy food in supermarkets, in disparate access in different neighborhoods, are laws and legal mechanisms ever invoked and used as approaches to address these questions, or are these issues addressed more through purely voluntary community organizing routes?
Well, you obviously cannot change the dimensions of change that are required can take place unless you are also changing at the level of policy and kind of the institutional framework that is associated with the need for policy change. So, you know, banning sodas from vending machines was a policy change. And it was an argument that, particularly in, that had a strong justice message that went with it. You know, first of all, the health message. Secondly, the constituency of, in that particular instance in Los Angeles Unified School District, but more generally in the public school system where you had those vending machines and how they emerged as a dominant part, you know, a key part of the school food environment beginning in the 1970s. That those questions were really critical justice questions. You also had the constituency was low income. Much of our school-age population is low income. So there were a range of these questions that were brought forth when the debate took place in the school district about what to do. But the argument was also that these are this is an institutional issue. It's not just a disparity issue, which is key, a justice issue, but it's a system issue. It's the way that for example, the soft drink industry, the Pepsis and the Cokes, had played a role in building up and reinforcing the idea that vending machines, what are called competitive foods, were really part and parcel of the school food environment. And so they had to be challenged as well. And you could do that through program and voluntary action, but it had to be done at the level of policy and institutional change. So absolutely, you have to operate at all those different levels. In 2 years' time, well, currently, right now, there's federal legislation around child nutrition that comes up periodically. It's the reauthorization process. Those issues are really critical in terms of food system change. In a couple of years' time, the Farm Bill, which is a misnomer because it really so influences, it's really a food system bill in terms of how it operates. It's been defined as a farm bill. And for years, it comes up, it's reauthorized every 5 years or so, and it's coming up again in 2012, 2013, in that period. That the influence of the Farm Bill has to do with what crops are grown, what subsidies are associated with those crops that are grown. It has to do with the entitlement programs like food stamps and how they're utilized. It has to do with issues around favoring agriculture that's oriented towards export and all the players that provide the inputs for the type of agriculture that has been favored, the kind of industrial agricultural system that's been created over a period of time. So what happens in that Farm Bill is really critical to the food system. And since the late 1980s, but particularly in the last 2 or 3 Farm Bills, the different food groups, food movement groups, have begun to mobilize a little bit, not necessarily in a coherent way in terms of mobilizing around it, but the strength of a food movement will be identified by its capacity to speak in a unified voice about why this farm bill is really a food bill and how it has to be restructured to deal with the issues that are so critical around how the food system operates. And so that's a political, policy, legal question. So yes, absolutely, you have to operate in that level.
And can I ask, to what extent do these issues fall out along conventional party lines, or do they cross them?
Well, yes and no. They don't in the places where that industrial agriculture system is supported, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. But the idea of changing certain pieces of that farm bill will resonate more with kind of urban low-income communities and the representation in those communities, which would fall more in line with the Democratic Party. But I think you don't want to think, when you mobilize around those issues, you want to not put it in the context of classic partisan electoral focus. You want to mobilize as if this was a social movement. And as a social movement, it operates in the political sphere, but it's doing a lot of other things as well. And that's really critical, and will be in terms of what happens in the next farm bill. And it doesn't I mean, it does matter to a certain extent who's going to head up the different committee structures that will shepherd the farm bill through, or any other legislation. But at some other some other fundamental level, in terms of our capacity to influence change, it matters more in terms of how that organizing, that cohesive voice about system change gets articulated and mobilized. Yeah, good.
Okay. Hi, my name's
I see.
Oh, sorry. My name's Elizabeth. I am a student at GPIA here, and I'm studying health and development. And my question, I'm originally from the Midwest, and the Midwest has a lot more chain restaurants than New York, obviously. And also, there's a higher population of obesity in the Midwest related to here. And you can, the relationship, obviously, is due to the menus and chain restaurants when appetizers have like 1,500 calories. And in New York, when that's just not, there aren't any chain restaurants and the menus just don't have that many calories, you can see the relationship. So my question to you is, do you know if Washington is trying to address this problem where chain restaurants just don't have as many calories or anything? So.
Well, I wouldn't entirely agree with the characterization of that there aren't those kinds of issues in New York. You do have differences in different parts of the country. That's for sure an important point to make. And if you look at the obesity map, where obesity prevalence can be identified, what you find, if you look at the map in 1980, and then 1990 and 2000 and 2010, what you're seeing is, even in the areas, sort of the light blue states, if you will, if you want to use partisan language, as opposed to the dark red states, dark red places, if you're moving from less obese to more obese, you find that in each of the areas, there's been this phenomenal increase. Whether it's New York or the Midwest, even if there are, as there are, differences in different parts of the region, South, Midwest, having higher obesity rates, but across the board, California and New York included, you've had this really quite extraordinary change, and that's a food system change. The food system does operate in New York. It may be, you might not have the chain, the same way the chain stores and fast food operates in other places, but you're still bombarded with the messages, and you're still subject to the influences that prevail nationwide and globally.
But would you agree if chain restaurants wouldn't have things on their menu that are 1,500 calories, then it might be helpful? So
well, no, that becomes part of how you start cutting through what you need to do. I'm not saying one shouldn't do that, and I'm not. And you do have in New York and in LA, probably more in New York, a greater number of food activist groups and food movement initiatives than anywhere else in the country. But first of all, it's not enough. And secondly, it's not the case that that's not happening in other places as well. And we need to be thinking about how you make the connections with what goes on in one place with what goes on in the other. The other part of the question, just really quickly, what's going on in DC? There are some mixed messages. Michelle Obama has become a foodie. And the Let's Move initiative, which is significantly health-based, but it's also focused on food, has been an important change. Is it a full kind of expression, articulation of food justice? No. But does it open up doors? Does it create opportunities? Absolutely. On the other hand, the Obama administration has appointed folks from Monsanto and done other things that appears to be kind of the traditional strategy in which the food industry has really dominated the politics within the federal government and in Congress. So it operates both ways. You have some changes taking place in Washington. You have some opportunities because of that when things like the Farm Bill come up that you might not have had otherwise, or when child nutrition legislation comes up. But it's a complicated situation, and it's indicative of what's going on in the food system. So are you giving microphones out to people ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't call on people. I'll let you call on people.
Let me call on people? You're closer to me. There you go.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm actually a former Peace Corps volunteer, and I worked in crop extension in South America. And my question is, I found it very easy to engage myself, obviously, in a lot of what you're promoting in South America, but I find it a little bit more difficult to do that here in the United States. And so I guess my question is, what are some recommendations you can give to an individual that wants to be action-oriented beyond just following and supporting legislation?
Well, how many people here are active in food groups? I would start with finding out what they all do. And how many of you who raised your hand could use someone to work with you in terms of things that you need to? Well, not everybody raised their hands, but if you go to the groups, I bet you they'll say, yeah, we need, there are lots of intervention points. There are lots of ways to be engaged, from organizing to bring about change, from thinking about innovative programs that could be developed that highlight the way change can happen, for doing research that connects with both an understanding of and pinpointing the opportunities for change. Whether it's in how many of you are students here or elsewhere? You know, there's lots going on in terms of both students getting active and interested in food, but groups like the Real Food Challenge that are saying, we need to change our institution itself in terms of what goes on, whether it's the sourcing of food or other opportunities for students to be engaged. So there's no shortage of opportunities to become active around food. And it's a wonderful time to be asking that question because the opportunities are really there.
Hi. I'm over here.
Oh, there you are.
My name's Heather. I'm an attorney, and food justice is just more of a personal interest for me. But I do work in labor law, and so I'm interested to know how much of a role you think that is going to take in, you know, cheap labor for farms, giving us cheaper food, and how much you think that's going to be changing in the future.
You know, I had this afternoon, I met with some kind of social justice-oriented funders who wanted to know about and connect around food justice. And they invited a woman from the restaurant workers group who had some pretty compelling things to say. You know, the group that was the top of the tower restaurant 9/11, and they initially organized support for the unionized restaurant workers that lost their jobs. I think what the funders were saying, rightfully, is that the food movement has tended to not focus on the work and labor side of the food system, with the possible exception of at different moments in time around farm labor, farm workers, but not necessarily thinking about across the board or how that operates and how changes in the food system have really significantly changed the face of the food workforce, which is a huge part of the labor market. The numbers vary in terms of the research I've seen, but we're talking, you know, more than 10% of the entire workforce is in food operations of one kind or another. So food justice, and I was trying to argue before, has to be thinking about how it operates, particularly in terms of these disparities, but also as system issues, where you're thinking about how is food produced, how is it grown, how is it sold. There are efforts to change the nature of the food retail business, and that's a very powerful labor issue. The advent of fast food was, in fact, a restaurant worker issue as well. So I would say use your attorney skills. We need them in labor law to be part of the change around food justice.
Hi, Jerry Spivak, Values Caucus. I have a question for you. You're talking systems, and the system that you've analyzed so far is what goes on internally within this food system. There's a larger system, which is the social change system, and how you go about doing it. And what I see in that system is that there are nice guys like yourself, and the only thing they're missing is money and power. And then there are the lobbies, and what they have is money and power. And not only that, but the Supreme Court has recently said that they don't even have to divulge what money, what power they're exerting. So it sounds like you're fighting a losing battle. I mean, just at the first glance at the system. And so I'm wondering how you expect to win and what major tactics you would then add that would fight off these lobbies and power so you're able to be successful.
Well, let me answer that this way. One of the important dimensions of building a social movement is what traditions are there that help sustain and expand those social movements. And what we have lost in this country, or the gaps that we have in this country, are particularly a very weak labor movement and the lack of a social democratic tradition, where in today's world that gets articulated that government is the problem and corporations are ignored, which connects at least indirectly to your focus on money and power. So does that mean we're doomed? I don't think so. Maybe it's the fact that activism is in my DNA. Actually, I was going to mention this. Last time I was at the New School was as a student in the late 1960s, and where we closed down the New School in protest against the war in Vietnam. So I think of social change all the time. And when I got involved in the environmental movement, what was very compelling about the environmental movement was its capacity to talk about ways in which change needed to occur that were not narrow, but really looked at issues of production, issues of nature, issues of urban life and urban form. But as I laid out in terms of the earlier work, the difficulty was when you really separated that from a kind of a justice perspective. And that started to change with the environmental movement. And I think the food movement has that same capacity.
But the problem is the environmental movement. We just saw what happened in Denmark, where, again, it seems like these powerful interests are able to stop major legislation or changes from taking place. So, again, it's nice to have a large systems view, but if you can't do anything, it's a little frustrating.
Where in the less developed countries that are also so heavily subject to the way, thinking about this in terms of food, the way the food system operates. But is change possible? For sure, change is possible. Social movements do make history. They do make change. They change not only the culture, they change the political dimensions. Are they up against very powerful forces? Absolutely. But there is some truth to the slogans out there, that if you build a social movement, if you have the power, you speak truth to power, if you have a movement that really cuts across class and race, you really have the ability to make that kind of change. And can it be sustained? It's difficult. We're up against quite a bit, no question about it.
We have time for just one more question, and then we will have some informal time to chat over some food and wine. And so last person with a question?
Hi, my name is Nin, and I'm the Youth Programs Coordinator for Slow Food USA. And my question also has to do about power. So I think I heard you say that the history of the environmental justice movement started, in the late 80s and 90s and kind of built off on other social movements before that. And my understanding of that is that the environmental justice movement actually traces back all the way to anti-colonization and the issue of land ownership and fighting back for sovereignty to kind of grow your own food on your own land and eat the way that you want to eat. And so given that history and given the fact that a lot of farmers and small farmers and farmers of color are losing their land and losing their farms, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the intersection between the environmental justice movement, food justice, and also food sovereignty. Because when we're talking about low-income communities of color growing their own food or growing providing culturally appropriate food for their own communities and kind of revitalizing community economies and things like that. We're talking about sovereignty and kind of, to some extent, challenging power dynamics in the U.S. And so if you could speak to that, that would be cool. Yeah.
Good. Covered a lot of ground there also. Just narrowly, there is a food sovereignty movement globally. Food sovereignty as a language of the idea that you have the right to land, the right to place, that we have the right to grow our own food, and then the criticism of how those rights are being undermined as part of the language of food sovereignty. Saturday is Food Sovereignty Day, and it would be good for us to all celebrate that, because there are movements in the Global South who, in particular, have been central to creating a new language around food and building on that history that was so important in terms of creating that language. And in this country, food sovereignty, what we've argued in our book is that food sovereignty and the connection to those movements in places like Korea and Mexico and Guatemala takes food justice and puts it within a global context, which we haven't really talked about that much tonight, but you can't have a food justice movement that doesn't think and act globally at the same time as it's operating at that most intimate and local level, which is also part of kind of the food justice mantra. And to make cause with how those different movements around the world have come together under the banner of food sovereignty. Slow food, which you're part of, I think is an interesting illustration of what is taking place in around the influence of food justice on the food movement. When slow food emerged in this country, not internationally, but, and this is my perspective, and you can put your perspective on that as well, of course. The slow food movement internationally was a highly charged political movement where, Carlo Petrini's argument that eating is a political act was central to thinking about how you made system change. But part of that argument also was a connection to food and thinking about the pleasure of food when you have that connection, when it's grown, that you grow it and that you connect to it, and it's part of the sort of the cultural fabric of who you are and where you come from. And when it got translated in this country initially, it was seen as part of the argument that slow food was really a kind of an illustration of the niche movement, of the food movement. Slow food belonged to people who had the capacity to eat slowly, right? So they didn't have two jobs, and they didn't have problems of access because they could get the food that they could appreciate. And that was a problem. Not that one shouldn't eat slowly, and that one shouldn't connect and enjoy the food that one eats, and understand where it comes from, and make that part of your cultural makeup. But it got articulated in a way that it contributed to this notion of the food movement as an elitist movement. And I think the slow food movement has changed in this country, and it is much more a food justice movement. It is talking about different ways in which we make food available to everybody in a context of food that could be appreciated and connected to. And I think there are other things that could happen both with the slow food movement and the broader food movement that could enrich it even further. But that makes me optimistic because I see the language of food justice increasingly helping define the food movement in a direction that it really does need to go, and that it will serve as a way to break through this argument that it just belongs to a few people who can eat slowly or eat in expensive restaurants. That's not the food movement that we all want, and it's not the food movement that's happening.
Thank you very much, Bob.